Now I have everything needed. Let me write the full script. Now writing the full script with all the live data integrated. The WTA just secured the largest sponsorship deal in the 52-year history of women's tennis. $500 million, Mercedes-Benz, a decade-long commitment that was supposed to signal the dawn of a golden era. And right in the middle of that golden era, they buried their biggest star on court 6. Let that land for a second. The most electric, most followed, most commercially magnetic young player on the entire women's tour, a 20-year-old from the Philippines who defeated Iga Swiatek, who sold out venues from Melbourne to Dubai, who made fans travel 12 hours by plane just to watch her play, was handed a secondary court with barely enough seats to fit a school gym. And the sponsors noticed, the fans noticed, and now the entire tennis world is asking the same furious question. How does the WTA sign a $500 million deal with one hand and disrespect their most bankable asset with the other? Stay until the very end, because what's happening behind closed doors at the WTA right now is far more explosive than anything happening on the court. There is a particular kind of athlete who arrives in a sport and shifts the entire gravitational pull of the conversation. Not gradually, not politely, violently, undeniably. Eala is that kind of athlete. Born in the Philippines, trained at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, this 20-year-old left-hander arrived on the WTA Tour not with a whisper, but with a detonation. At the 2025 Miami Open, entering as a wild card ranked 148th in the world, she obliterated 3 consecutive opponents who had no business losing to someone the draw treated as an afterthought. First came Jelena Ostapenko, a Grand Slam champion, then Madison Keys, then, in perhaps the most seismic upset of the entire year, Iga Swiatek, the 5-time Grand Slam winner, the woman who had spent years at the summit of women's tennis, fell to a 20-year-old who had never played in a WTA 1000 semifinal before that week. Those 3 victories did not just change Eala's ranking, they changed the entire commercial conversation around women's tennis. Within days of that Miami run, every metric that matters in modern sport exploded around her name. Social media engagement, search traffic, ticket demand, broadcast viewership. The numbers did not creep upward, they launched. Filipino fans who had waited decades for one of their own to compete at this level mobilized with a ferocity and devotion that tournament organizers had never encountered before. These were not passive viewers clicking play on a highlight. These were people booking international flights, buying courtside tickets, wearing national colors, painting faces, singing songs. They filled stadiums. They drove ticket revenue. They brought an entirely new demographic to a sport that had been searching for new audiences for years. By March 31, 2025, Eala entered the WTA's top 100, the first Filipino in history to do so. The milestone was covered not just in sports pages, but in mainstream media across Southeast Asia, where 1 billion-plus potential viewers suddenly had a reason to care about tennis scheduling decisions in Melbourne and Dubai. She became the first Filipina to win a WTA 125 title when she defeated Panna Nvardi in Guadalajara. She reached the quarterfinals of the Eastbourne Open. She won gold at the SEA Games. She defeated Clara Tauson at the U.S. Open, the first time any Filipino player had ever won a Grand Slam main draw match in the Open era. Nike designed her a custom hair tie in the shape of a sampaguita blossom, the national flower of the Philippines, for her Wimbledon debut. Not because Nike does that for every promising young player, because Eala became a symbol, a cultural touchstone, a commercial phenomenon wearing a tennis dress. Former champion Tina Krizan, commentating live on Sky Sports, compared her to Leylah Fernandez, a player who reached a Grand Slam final, but noted that Eala carried heavier ground strokes and already ranked inside the top 40. The praise was significant. What was more significant was what happened whenever she walked onto a court. The stadium filled. Every single time. So ask yourself this. When you possess an athlete capable of filling any venue on the planet, an athlete whose fan base spans continents, an athlete whose name alone drives ticket revenue into orbit, what do you do with her? Apparently, if you're the WTA, you put her on court 6 and then act surprised when the world erupts. Stick with this, because what happened next didn't just embarrass one tournament, it lit a fuse under the most lucrative sponsorship negotiation in women's tennis history. January 2026, the Australian Open, Melbourne Park, one of the 4 most prestigious tennis venues on Earth, home to Rod Laver Arena and a capacity crowd capable of holding 15,000 roaring fans on the main stage. Alex Eala, ranked 49th in the world, the most talked about player on the entire tour, a woman whose previous tournament appearances had caused the kind of organized, passionate crowd mobilization that tournament directors dream about, was scheduled to play her first round match on court 6. Court 6. A court designed for early round matches between players ranked outside the top 200. A court where perhaps a few hundred spectators can squeeze around the edges if every single seat is occupied. A court that does not have the infrastructure, the sound system, the broadcast angles, or the seating capacity to hold the volume of interest that follows Alex Eala everywhere she goes. What happened was entirely predictable, which makes it so much more infuriating in retrospect. Filipino fans, many of who had traveled 12 hours from Sydney, others who had flown internationally, arrived at Melbourne Park and discovered that the player they had crossed oceans to see was buried on a side court with no room for them. One fan, posting on Reddit, described the scene. People lined the fences 3 and 4 deep, craning for a glimpse. Others simply could not get close. A major Australian news outlet did not mince words, reporting that tournament organizers had flubbed the schedule by assigning Eala to a venue wholly inadequate for the demand she generated. On the WTA's own digital platforms, outrage spread with extraordinary velocity. WTA should have done their research better, wrote one fan. They know Eala's appeal and should have pushed for a bigger stage. Another described the decision as simply dumb, arguing that fans who had made the journey of a lifetime deserved better. A third went further, saying, to make this mistake once is dumb, to ever do it again is unforgivable. The match itself, against American Alicia Parks, only amplified the disaster. Eala won the first set 6-love. A bagel so commanding, it suggested the crowd noise alone was rattling Parks, who later admitted, "It was very difficult. I was expecting it, but I wasn't. She definitely has a good crowd. I just kept telling myself to stay in the zone." Parks eventually recovered to win the match, but even in defeat, the story Eala told was deafening. The narrative around the scheduling failure grew louder than the result. But here is where this stops being about one tournament and starts being about something far larger. Because at the exact same moment that Melbourne was bungling Eala's scheduling, the WTA was in the final stages of closing the most transformative commercial deal in its 52-year existence, a deal that would position the entire organization as a legitimate global sports powerhouse, a deal worth more money than anything women's tennis had ever seen, and the brands at the table were watching. You think the Australian Open incident was the end? It wasn't even close to the beginning. What happened in Dubai just weeks later turned a scheduling embarrassment into a full-scale institutional crisis. February 2026, the Dubai Tennis Championships. The WTA Tour, driven by Mercedes-Benz, as it was now branded, following the landmark December 2025 announcement of a $50 million per year deal between the German automotive giant and the Women's Tour, was 3 weeks into its first official season. The stakes could not have been steeper. Mercedes-Benz had not simply written a check. They had staked their brand identity on the proposition that women's tennis represented the future of premium sport. Their head of brand experience, Matthias Geisen, had stood at a press conference in Stuttgart and declared, This partnership reflects our strong commitment not only to the sport, but also to the values it represents: performance, precision, and progress. Coco Gauff, present at the announcement, told the assembled media, "To see how far our sport has come to have a partnership with Mercedes-Benz is super special. For a long time, women's sports were maybe pushed to the side, and this proves that the dreams of young girls in sports are worth investing in." $500 million, a decade, the largest sponsorship commitment in the history of women's sport. And then the WTA turned around and scheduled their most commercially valuable player as an afterthought. In the early rounds at Dubai, tournament organizers assigned Eala to secondary courts at awkward times, forcing Filipino fans whose presence had already proven essential to ticket revenue to either watch from inadequate venues or miss matches entirely due to time zone challenges back home. When the backlash from Australia had not yet faded, here was another scheduling oversight adding fuel to a fire that was rapidly becoming impossible to contain. The fan response on social media was immediate and volcanic. One commenter captured the collective sentiment precisely. "Alex is undeniably the most famous player here. Everyone knows who most people came to see." The phrase, "undeniably the most famous," was not the hyperbole of a devoted follower. It reflected a measurable commercial reality. In poll after poll among engaged tennis audiences, Eala outpolled established stars. According to Talking Points data, 79% of fans preferred watching Eala over Coco Gauff. 89% chose her over Emma Raducanu. Those numbers are not irrelevant background noise. Those are the exact numbers that brands and television networks use to determine where their money flows. Organizers in Dubai eventually relented, scheduling Eala as the final night session match on center court for her second and third round appearances, a concession that validated every criticism that had come before it. The WTA's official website noted the correction. Critics noted that it required a public campaign of sustained pressure to produce a decision that should have been self-evident from the moment the draw was announced. Coco Gauff, after defeating Eala in the Dubai quarterfinals, did something that told its own story. During her post-match press conference, she apologized directly to Eala's fans for making them wait to see their favorite player. Not a generic thank you to the crowd, a targeted, personal acknowledgement that Eala's supporters deserved better treatment from the tournament structure than they had consistently received. When your competitor's star is apologizing on behalf of your organizational failures, you have a serious institutional problem. And the brands? They were asking questions. Hard ones. Here's the part nobody's talking about loudly enough, because what the scheduling controversy actually threatened wasn't just Eala's career, it threatened the entire commercial architecture the WTA had spent 3 years constructing. To understand why this matters beyond court assignments and fan frustration, you need to understand exactly what the WTA has built and what it stands to lose. In 2023, the WTA partnered with CVC Capital Partners, one of the world's premier private equity firms, injecting $150 million into a new commercial entity called WTA Ventures. The mandate was explicit: triple commercial revenue by 2029. In year one, WTA Ventures increased revenue by 24%, a record. The strategy attracted Rolex, Morgan Stanley, Tencent via a 6-year broadcast deal through 2032, and ultimately Mercedes-Benz as the crown jewel. Mercedes-Benz deal alone, $50 million annually, potentially extending a decade, represents $500 million in committed investment. The WTA Tour is now commercially branded as WTA Tour driven by Mercedes-Benz. The brand's presence extends across nearly 30 tournaments in 2026. WTA CEO Marina Storti stated publicly that the goal was to make women's tennis a commercial powerhouse capable of funding pay equity at every level of the tour. Billie King herself described the Mercedes-Benz partnership as a message to the entire world that women's sport matters. Now consider what that extraordinary commercial architecture rests upon. It rests on viewership, engagement, fan devotion, star power. The belief that sponsors pay enormous sums to associate with delivers an audience worth reaching, a narrative worth investing in, and athletes worth celebrating. Eala is currently the single most potent embodiment of all three of those propositions. She is 20 years old, ranked inside the top 40, and carries a fan base of tens of millions across an entire archipelago nation of 110 million people who had zero meaningful connection to professional tennis before she arrived. The Philippine Open, a WTA event specifically to capitalize on her commercial drawing power, is an entirely new market, a new revenue stream, a new audience demographic that didn't exist in the WTA's commercial calculations 3 years ago. When sponsors invest at the scale Mercedes-Benz has invested, they do not simply write checks. They monitor, they measure, they expect the organization receiving their investment to demonstrate competence in deploying the assets they are paying to associate with. When those assets, specifically the most watched, most searched, most commercially relevant player on the tour, are the scheduling disasters surrounding Eala did not occur in isolation. They occurred within a specific, documented pattern, and that pattern is what makes this story more than a collection of bad organizational decisions. Before Melbourne and Dubai, there were earlier incidents. Eala had been placed on smaller courts at strange hours throughout the 2025 season. The Tennis Gazette, one of the sport's most widely read digital publications, documented the pattern explicitly, writing that the powers that be haven't done enough to capitalize on her popularity and have often scheduled her at strange times on smaller courts. The phrasing is careful. The implication is not. When a publication that covers women's tennis professionally uses the phrase "the powers that be" in relation to the treatment of a specific player, they are not describing an accident. They are describing a recurring institutional failure to recognize, or perhaps deliberately choosing to discount, the value of a player whose commercial appeal lies outside the traditional demographic centers of the WTA's historical fan base. The WTA built its commercial identity around European and American stars. For decades, the narrative of women's tennis was constructed around players from those geographies. The tour's scheduling architecture, broadcast arrangements, and promotional hierarchies all evolved around that demographic assumption. When a 20-year-old from Southeast Asia suddenly outpolls established European and American stars in audience preference surveys by margins of 79 and 89%, the system does not automatically recalibrate, it resists. Fans recognized this resistance before the WTA's leadership acknowledged it. The Reddit threads, the Twitter rage, the organized social media campaigns demanding better treatment for Eala, these were not simply expressions of partisan fandom. They were accurate diagnoses of a structural misalignment between the WTA's commercial ambitions and its operational decisions. The WTA, to its credit, has attempted to respond. The correction in Dubai, placing Eala on center court for later rounds, was real, even if belated. The launch of the Philippine Open as a dedicated WTA event represents genuine institutional acknowledgement that Eala's market is valuable enough to build an entire tournament around. The tour has publicly celebrated her milestones. They have highlighted her victories. They have posted her highlights. But posting highlights is not the same as protecting her draw. Celebrating milestones is not the same as building an operational framework that treats her audience with the same respect extended to the audiences of European players ranked identically or lower in the same draws. The sponsors understand this distinction. When Mercedes-Benz invested $50 million annually in the WTA, they were not investing in highlight reels. They were investing in the proposition that the WTA's leadership would maximize the commercial potential of every premium asset on tour. In a sport where Eala is the premium asset, not a secondary curiosity, not an Asian novelty, but the most commercially potent individual in the sport at this specific moment in history, the gap between rhetoric and execution becomes a brand liability. Marina Storti told the Financial Times that WTA Ventures' goal was to make women's tennis a commercial powerhouse. She spoke about reaching a global audience of over 1 billion people. She described the strategy as broad-based, multi-pillar, not dependent on any single market. The Philippines alone represents over 100 million people. Add the diaspora, add the connected Southeast Asian audience watching every Eala match with the intensity of a nation discovering its first sporting hero at the elite level. That is not a niche. That is a continent. The WTA cannot claim to be building a billion-person global audience while simultaneously mismanaging the player who represents direct access to hundreds of millions of those people. And now, right now, in February 2026, here is exactly where things stand, and what happens next could define the WTA's entire commercial future for the next decade. The story of Eala and the WTA's institutional failures is not finished. It is unfolding in real time, which is precisely why it demands attention right now, rather than in retrospect. As of February 2026, Eala sits inside the WTA's top 40, ranked around number 40, continuing a trajectory that began when she entered the year ranked 148. She defeated Swiatek. She defeated Keys. She eliminated Ostapenko. She broke into the top 100, the top 75, the top 50, the top 40, each milestone documented by a nation of 110 million people watching with collective breath held, sharing clips, trending hashtags, booking travel, buying tickets. In Dubai, the tournament that became the flashpoint for this current wave of institutional scrutiny, she played Coco Gauff in the quarterfinals. The match drew crowds that organizers had never managed well enough and media attention that confirmed every argument her supporters had been advancing for months. She is not approaching the summit of women's tennis. She is already rewriting the commercial map of it. The WTA, for its part, appears to be absorbing the lessons, slowly, imperfectly, under duress rather than proactively. Center court assignments arrived, eventually. The Philippine Open exists, scheduling acknowledgments have been made, but the pattern of correction only after crisis suggests an organization still reacting to pressure rather than building proactive systems worthy of the commercial partnerships it has secured. Mercedes-Benz invested $500 million based on a vision of women's tennis as a premium global property. That vision requires operational execution at every level, including, fundamentally, ensuring that the sport's most commercially potent draw is treated as the headline act she demonstrably is. The sponsors are not threatening to walk away tomorrow, but the conversations are happening. The questions are being asked. The measurement frameworks that accompany nine-figure investments include assessments of whether the organization receiving that investment is managing its assets intelligently. Right now, those assessments are not generating uniformly comfortable answers. And here's the truth that sits underneath all of this. The truth that the WTA's leadership understands, even if they have not yet fully acted upon it. Eala is not a regional curiosity enjoying a temporary moment. She is the most important commercial development in women's tennis since the sport identified China as a growth market 20 years ago. The WTA built its current financial architecture partly on the back of Chinese players, Chinese audiences, and Chinese broadcast rights. That blueprint exists. The organization knows how to do this. The question is whether they will apply that blueprint to Eala proactively, building scheduling frameworks, broadcast agreements, marketing campaigns, and commercial structures specifically designed to maximize the Filipino market, or whether they will continue reacting to each crisis as it emerges, apologizing retroactively, and hoping that sponsors remain patient. Because here is what the data says plainly. Fans are not patient. They traveled 12 hours to Melbourne. They stayed up past midnight in Manila to watch Dubai. They mobilized social media campaigns powerful enough to force scheduling changes at major tournaments. They are invested in a way that money cannot manufacture. And the sponsors who write 9-figure checks specifically to associate with that kind of devotion, they are not patient either. Eala herself, reflecting on the Melbourne experience, said something that deserves to echo far beyond the surface of a tennis court. "I'm still young, 20, so learning how to deal with all of this attention. I guess this is one of the moments that I can reflect on what this means for Philippine tennis." She is not asking for special treatment. She is not demanding headlines. She is simply showing up, winning matches that reshape global rankings, and representing something larger than herself with extraordinary composure at an age when most players are still figuring out their serve. The WTA has the largest sponsorship deal in its history. It has a commercial strategy worth $500 million. It has a global audience target of over 1 billion people. And it has a 20-year-old from the Philippines who is doing the hardest part of that job, building genuine human devotion at massive scale, without institutional support worthy of what she brings. So here's the question, not a rhetorical one, not a provocative one, but a genuinely consequential one that the next 12 months will begin to answer. Will the WTA build its commercial future around the players who are already creating it, or will they keep correcting scheduling mistakes after the damage is done and hope that $500 million buys enough goodwill to survive their own institutional blindness? Leave your answer below, because this conversation is only getting louder. Alex Eala arrived at this moment in tennis history not because the system built a path for her. She arrived because she was too gifted, too driven, and too beloved to be ignored, even when the system tried. The WTA secured the most transformative